So we have two very well-known and very interesting speakers lined up to give keynote addresses, and I believe that both of them will be speaking for about 25 minutes or something. Yeah, 25 minutes. First, we'll be hearing from Marc Mauer, who's one of the leading experts on mass incarceration in the country. He's done a lot of work on sentencing policy, race in the criminal justice system. He's published in numerous places, including Young Black Men in the Criminal Justice System and the series Americans Behind Bars. He also runs the Sentencing Project, which began in 1987. His work not only appears in numerous books and scholarly journals, but also in the media and in congressional testimony. So he's really one of our leading experts on mass incarceration and thinking about it from a criminal justice perspective. Then I guess I'll give both introductions now, and then we'll kind of transition into this. Sorry. So then we're going to hear from Ernest Drucker, who's also very well known as somebody who's really tried to forge these linkages between population health and mass incarceration. He's a professor emeritus in the Department of Family and Social Medicine at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and also affiliated as associate and scholar at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, also in New York. His work has been published in numerous places, including what is the name of the book? Oh, there it is, A Plague of Prisons, a book that was published in 2011, A Plague of Prisons, The Epidemiology of Mass Incarceration in America, which is really one of the seminal publications that tries to bring to the attention of population health scholars the need to really be thinking about the consequences of mass incarceration. So we're delighted to have these two very esteemed scholars with us today. And without further ado, then, I'm going to turn the floor over to Marc Mauer. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was very well done for someone who didn't know he's going to be the moderator, too, I think. I am delighted to be here, both for personal and professional reasons. Personally, I lived in Ann Arbor for about 13 years, many, many years ago, so it's always a treat to come back home. We have sort of family connections with the School of Public Health. My wife is fond of saying she has half a master's degree from the School of Public Health, but at least in those days you had to complete the second year too, so she's gone on to other pursuits. But I would fully agree with the opening themes here that I think increasingly scholars, the public, people concerned about prison issues are recognizing how all these themes come together, and that studying what happens to people in prison has been important ever since we started building prisons, but the ripple effects, the consequences are very complex now, affect all of us in ways that go well beyond just people in prison and their loved ones, and increasingly we need to address those issues, those problems, and see what makes better sense in public policy. So what I want to try to do is to frame more or less how we got here today. My book, I call it The Race to Incarcerate, which is 40 years old now, and trace where that comes from in terms of the policies and the politics that got us here, say a little bit about what we know about the impact of those policies, and where does that leave us today. So the race to incarcerate goes back to 1972, basically. That was the year that the prison population started rising in this country. And one way to think about the scale of that is imagine we're back in 1972, Richard Nixon is president, and let's imagine that President Nixon comes on television to talk to the American people about the problem of crime and what we should do about it. And here's what he says. My fellow Americans, we have a terrible problem of crime in this country, but I have a plan for dealing with it. Here's my plan. First, we're going to build 1 million prison cells and fill them as quickly as possible. Second, because we know that crime tends to take place in minority communities, we're going to reserve 60% of those cells for blacks and Hispanics. And third, we're going to put 3,000 people on death row and start to execute them as quickly as possible. That's my plan for dealing with crime. Now, Richard Nixon never made such a statement, but what would have been the response if he had? Well, I think there would have been great outrage by civil rights organizations, civil liberties groups. I think we would have seen editorials in leading newspapers decrying this barbaric plan for dealing with a very complicated social problem. I think there would have been lots of outrage across the country. Well, Nixon never made such a speech or a plan, but this is precisely what our criminal justice system has produced over the last 40 years. Just to take a look at it, here we see the prison population in the United States for a period of about 50 years, from the 1925 to the early 70s. We see a little bit of change here and there. Some rise during the Depression, a decline during World War II, but no dramatic shifts over this nearly 50-year period. And starting in 1972, here's what happened. There's the addition of 1 million people to the prison population. As you know, now we have over 2 million people behind bars in our prisons and jails. To put some perspective on that, the United States is by far the world leader in its rate of incarceration. If you compare the U.S. to other industrialized nations, we lock up our citizens at 5 to 8 times the rate of those other nations. And, you know, it's fundamentally, I think, very troubling that the wealthiest society in the world, one that prides itself on its democratic tradition, somehow has come to use imprisonment at a rate far greater than any other nation. We also know, of course, that incarceration does not cut evenly across the board, that race and class are intimately involved in how we use imprisonment in this country, as well as other countries too. Research from the Justice Department tells us that if current trends continue, 1 of every 3 black males born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime, 1 of every 6 Latino males. For whites, 1 of every 17. The figures for women overall are lower, but we see racial, ethnic disparities there as well. So the challenge for us, I think, is to try to understand how did we get to this point? How did we get this unprecedented rise in the prison population that I think it's fair to say that really no one, no scholars, no political people or others anticipated at all 40 years ago when this all began. Well, the first possible explanation might be that if we have 6 times as many people in prison, we might have 6 times as much crime, and therefore that automatically leads to more people in prison. If we go back to the early years of this rise in imprisonment, rising rates of crime do explain part of the increase that we see. From the mid-60s to the mid-70s, there was a real increase in crime in the United States. A number of factors produced that. Part of that was the baby boom generation coming of age. You had more young males, 15 to 24, and all other things being equal, teenage boys do more bad things than other groups do. We had increasing urbanization, which is often associated with higher rates of crime. So a number of things coming together that helped to produce more crime, and presumably some of those people ended up in prison. But since about 1980, what we see overwhelmingly is that the rise in incarceration is a function of changes in policy, not changes in crime rates. Research by 2 of our leading criminologists, Al Bloomstein and Alan Beck, looked at the period 1980 to 2000, a time when the prison population tripled across the country, and their conclusion was that the entire change was due to changes in policy, specifically sentencing policy. So we began sending more people to prison given the rate of crime, and we kept them in prison for longer periods of time. More people going to prison, staying for longer periods of time. How did this come about? Well, it was largely due to the policy changes that we've come to know as the so-called Get Tough movement, which is get tough on crime by sending people to prison. And it's taken many forms. It's mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes and you're out, restrictions on parole release, and the like. There are many examples we could give. Let me just frame a couple of the more extreme situations. In the mid-1990s, about half the states adopted some type of 3 strikes and you're out policy, whereupon your 3rd serious felony, you could get a life sentence in prison. California, as many of you know, had the most extreme form of this policy, where your first 2 strikes had to be serious or violent as defined in the code, but your 3rd one could be any felony in the state of California. So the California law was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court in 2003. And the question was, did this represent cruel and unusual punishment? The 2 cases that came to the court, first one, a man's 3rd strike was stealing 3 golf clubs from a sporting goods store. He walked in the store, he had some baggy pants, put the clubs in his pants, walked out, and was immediately apprehended. The second one involved a man who, on 2 separate occasions within the same week, stole $153 worth of videotapes from a Kmart store. He was immediately apprehended too. So the court looked at the issue and whether this was cruel and unusual, and essentially rejected the argument, and their ruling basically said that they would defer to essentially the wisdom of the California legislature. If that's what the legislature believed was necessary to promote public safety, the court didn't want to be in the position of second-guessing them on public policy. So as a result, the golf club thief is serving 25 to life, and the videotape thief is doing 50 to life in California prisons. This is what our policies have brought us. I should note that just this past November, there was a ballot initiative in California that would actually restrict the use of 3 strikes, so these kinds of cases would no longer qualify, although the people who were sentenced have to individually petition to see if they can be released now. Another case, this is in a town of Tyler, Texas, some years ago. A man was arrested for stealing a candy bar, Snickers bar, from a convenience store. He walked out of the store, was arrested. Now, when you steal something from a convenience store of low value, a lot of different things could happen. They may make you pay for the candy bar. You might get some kind of citation, pay a fine or so. But you also can be charged with a crime. You can be charged with a felony, larceny from a building. You're taking property out of the building. And for whatever reason, the prosecutor in this case decided to charge this man with a felony charge. She also charged him because he had prior convictions as a habitual offender. His prior convictions were a series of other relatively minor property and some simple assault convictions. One was stealing a bag of cookies from a convenience store, so he's got this sweet tooth getting him in trouble and all. So he goes to court, and his case is heard. He's convicted of the charges, and because he's got a felony, because he's a habitual offender, he's sentenced to 16 years in prison. The only thing more bizarre than that was afterwards the prosecutor was asked by a reporter, she was walking out of the courtroom, whether maybe this was a little excessive for stealing a candy bar, and her response was, it was a king-size candy bar. You couldn't make this up, right? Now, I don't want to suggest that most of the people in prison are there for stealing golf clubs and candy bars. That's not the case. Many people in prison today have committed serious crimes. People in prison, some of them do represent a threat to public safety, at least in the short run. But if we look overall at who's in prison today and who they are, I think the picture is actually a very sobering one. We know for a start nearly half the people in prison today are serving a sentence for a nonviolent crime. Some of them have prior offenses, but their current offense is nonviolent. If we look at their backgrounds and who they are, 3/4 of them have a history of substance abuse. 1 of every 6 has a history of mental illness. We look at women in prison. More than half have been victims of physical or sexual abuse. We could go on in terms of painting a portrait of, extreme social disadvantage as a group of people, none of which condones the behaviors they engaged in, but it certainly helps us to at least understand some of the circumstances that led to their being in prison today. In terms of the policy changes that have produced these developments, in addition to the overall Get Tough movement, of course, is the inception of the war on drugs in the 1980s, which is probably the single most significant factor over the next 25 years. And just to give a scale of the sense of that, in 1980, there were about 40,000 people in prison or jail, either serving time or awaiting trial for a drug offense, 40,000. Today, that figure is 500,000 behind bars for a drug offense. So we have more people locked up for drug offense today than the entire prison and jail population back in 1980. And despite some, I think, constructive developments in terms of how we deal with people charged with drug crimes, those figures are not declining substantially at all these days. So we have these record numbers. I think it's no surprise, it's well documented now that the war on drugs has really been a two-tiered war on drugs. For families in well-off communities who find that their teenage son or daughter has a drug problem, they don't typically call the police and demand that their daughter be arrested and sentenced to prison on a mandatory drug charge as a way of dealing with the problem. They deal with it as a public health issue, a family issue, a treatment issue. We throw money at problems when we have the money that we can throw at it. When it's low-income communities, disadvantaged communities, communities of color, we're much more likely to describe this as a criminal justice problem. And then rather than throwing money, we throw police, prosecutors, prison cells at the problem. So we have very different approaches depending on where one sits and how we think about the issues. So we have this dramatic rise in prison. What do we know about the impact, the effect over this period of time? The first-ish area we want to look at, of course, would be public safety, because presumably the goal of putting more people in prison is to promote public safety, and that's certainly what the proponents of mass incarceration would argue. So what do we know about this? Well, if you look since the 1990s, some people will make the argument that incarceration works. We continue to have increased the prison population since the early 90s, and we've seen crime rates nationally go down quite substantially in the range roughly of 30% decline over the last 16 or 18 years or so. So we put more people in prison, crime goes down. That looks like a good way to deal with the problem. It turns out it's not quite that simple. If you look at the period immediately before this, in the late 80s, there was a period of about 7 years then when the incarceration rate actually went up quite substantially, and yet crime rates went up also. So it's not a case where we always know by putting more people in prison we're reducing crime. There's clearly more going on there. The best studies to date trying to look at why crimes began to decline in the 1990s, the more optimistic ones suggest that maybe 25% of the decline in violent crime was due to more incarceration. The less optimistic ones say it's as little as 10% of the decline was related to that. But let's assume for the moment 25% is roughly in the range of the effect of prison on reducing crime. Is that good news or bad news? Well, the good news is 25% is hardly a trivial decline in the number of crimes and victims that are being produced, and so we can feel good about having less crime. But the flip side is that tells us that 3/4 of the decline in crime had nothing to do with putting more people in prison. There's sort of ongoing debate and research about what some of those other factors are. Some of them are economic, some of them are changes in the drug trade, some of them are policing strategies, community strategies for dealing with public safety. It's a very complicated mix of things, but we've been conditioned in many ways to think of incarceration and crime being the only two issues to look at together when these are actually much more complicated problems. We also know, in some respects, you might think that it's whether or not you think putting more people in prison is a good thing in general, we might have expected even greater declines. After all, if we lead the world in incarceration, you could say, well, we should have, the lowest crime rates of any industrialized nation as a result, and yet clearly we don't. So why wouldn't we see more of an effect of what we've been doing? I think there are a number of explanations for this, but let me just offer one, which has to do with who we incarcerate and what we expect to get out of it. Think of two people who've been convicted of crimes. Offender A is a serial rapist who's been terrorizing a neighborhood. The police finally catch him, he's convicted, sent off to prison. So we've put one person in prison, but we've clearly had an impact on crime in that particular community. Offender B is a kid on the street corner who's selling drugs on Saturday night. The police come by, they do a drug sweep, pick him up and others, send him off to court. He's convicted, he's sentenced to one of these mandatory prison terms for selling drugs and goes away for 5 years. So in this case, just as with the serial rapist, we've put one person in prison. What have we done about crime when we send this lower level drug offender to prison? Well, if we go back to the street corner where he was selling drugs, how long is it going to take after he's taken off that street corner for somebody else to step up to that corner and try to meet the demand for drugs in that neighborhood? In a lot of places, it's going to take about 20 minutes or so, right? As long as we've got this demand, there's a seemingly endless number of people willing to try to meet that demand. And we know that for a fact because we've got tens of thousands of people who've been arrested for that, sent off to prison in many cases. So in this case, we've also increased the prison population by one person. It's hard to argue that we've had a significant effect on the crime problem or the drug problem on that street corner. But we've also done something else. Conservatively speaking, it costs about $25,000 a year to keep someone in prison. So a 5-year prison term for selling drugs, in effect, is a tax or a policy decision made to spend $125,000 to lock up this one person. Well, you start to multiply that out by the number of people we have incarcerated for drug offenses, low-level property offenses, and the like. The money does start to add up and raises the question about what else could we be doing on that street corner in that neighborhood that might promote public safety in more effective ways. So we see something about this impact. I think there's a pretty broad consensus among people who study these things that we're well past the point of diminishing returns in terms of any substantial effect on promoting public safety through expanded incarceration. But we also know, and this is what we're here for the next 2 days, is that the effects of incarceration certainly spill over to families and communities. We start with the 1.7 million children who have a parent behind bars on any given day. Because of the racial dynamics of incarceration, we see very skewed effects there. African American children, 1 of every 14 has a parent behind bars. African American children, as we saw up here, grow up in a context where whether or not they know the specific numbers we see in the charts, know that going to prison has become a very regular experience, certainly in many disadvantaged communities. So what does that say about their relations with their parents, teachers, ministers, and others in terms of life expectations? It's not a very good picture, I don't think. We see, and people are starting to look at now, the impact on community structures, the sort of destabilizing effect of having people flowing in and out of prison in huge numbers. We see very destabilizing effects on gender imbalance in communities. In Washington, D.C., in the neighborhoods of high incarceration, there are about 60 adult men for every 100 adult women in those neighborhoods. So where are the missing men? Well, some are in the military, some have died. Many of them are behind bars. And so how does that play out in those communities? So we have all sorts of ways in which we have to begin to think about these impacts. Now, this picture I've been painting, I think is sort of a grim one, but unfortunately, I think it's very accurate for what we've seen over 40 years. The good news, or at least the cautiously optimistic news, is that I think over the last decade or so, the political climate, the policies we use, practices, have been changing, at least modestly, in a more, what I would say, rational direction, more policy research-driven direction that may point to a better way. The current explanation for this change is that the fiscal crisis has focused the attention of political leaders, governors of both parties, in looking at how we spend money on corrections, trade-offs with higher education, and the like. And I think that's certainly part of the explanation, but I think the changes really predate the fiscal crisis. The whole field and programmatic effects of reentry, this goes back to the late 1990s or so. Reentry is a very simple concept. It basically says we can send as many people as we want to prison, but 95% of them are coming home someday, and it should be in the interest of liberals and conservatives alike that they come home better prepared to make it than before they went to prison. And, reentry is still a relative drop in the bucket in terms of the support it receives, but it's really been embraced by correction systems and communities around the country. We see changes in drug policy and approaches. Probably the most substantial has been the growth of the drug court movement. There's some 2,000 drug courts around the country. There is some debate about their effect on reducing incarceration. Some of them are more attuned to trying to think about the population that go through the drug court. But nonetheless, in a sort of symbolic way, we've seen that courts and communities alike have embraced the idea that we should try treatment as a first approach rather than incarceration as a first approach. And I think that's a substantial shift. We also see some changes in the sentencing policies that have really been driving all of this. The mandatory sentencing, some of the drug policies. Here in Michigan, the late 1990s, the state scaled back substantially what had been called the 650 lifer law. That was a law whereby if you were selling 650 grams of drugs, a little over a pound, you'd get a mandatory life without parole sentence, the same as for first-degree murder. The law had been on the books for 20 years. Some first-time offenders were serving life without parole, and it's finally scaled back. New York State had the notorious Rockefeller drug laws that sort of were the symbolic underpinnings of the war on drugs. It only took 35 years, but they were finally scaled back about 4 years ago. At the federal level, Congress had passed in the 1980s the crack cocaine mandatory sentencing laws, whereby crack cocaine was punished far more harshly than powder cocaine. More than 80% of the people sentenced for a crack offense were African American. Finally, in 2010, there was bipartisan support in Congress to reduce the differential in sentencing quite substantially also. And then finally, I think we're seeing now, after 4 decades of rising imprisonment, in the last several years, the prison population nationally is more or less stabilizing or even declining a bit, but with a couple of really leading examples of substantial change. New York, New Jersey in particular, reduced their prison populations by about 25% over the last decade. There's no adverse effects on public safety that we can document there. And so it raises some fundamental questions about the scale of incarceration and how quickly we might be able to try to reverse these dynamics. So as both a researcher and an advocate, it leaves me, as I said, cautiously optimistic that we can continue to see some changes. I think what we need to keep our eyes on foremost, though, is that we can't be satisfied with what's happening in general, which is really, I think, sort of tinkering around the edges of mass incarceration. It's nice that about half the states have seen a reduction in their prison population in the last couple of years, but a 1 or 2% reduction is not going to get us very far. So it really calls into question our whole approach to public safety, community development, and I think fundamentally we've come to rely on the criminal justice system as our primary approach to problems of disadvantaged communities. We all know that public safety is a much broader, more complicated issue to deal with, and what we have to get away fundamentally, I think, is not just developing more alternatives to incarceration and treatment programs, but more building strong families and strong communities that can promote public safety without needing the criminal justice system as the intervention to try to make that happen. So that's not an easy task, but I think our job is to try to work for incremental change on a daily basis, but also to raise a vision and a framework for thinking about how we can do things better. I very much look forward to the next couple of days thinking about this. I hope we come up with some good directions to move, and thanks very much for having me.
Thanks very much for those great comments.